Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So it is our absolute delight once again to have Professor Binder Singh and Professor Vijay Tankha with us. Today is Vijay Tankha's day, so I'll give you a very, very brief introduction because he has been extremely reluctant to talk about his immense contribution, which is, of course, we know him as a wonderful teacher in St. Stephen's, but he also has very significant research contributions. So I'll give you a peek into his work. Professor Vijay Tankha was the head of the Department of Philosophy in St. Stephen's College, where he founded the School of Languages and directed it for 11 years. After completing his doctoral degree from McGill University in the early works of Plato, Professor Tankha concentrated his research on pre-Socratic and Hellenic thoughts. He was a recipient of 2 extremely prestigious fellowships, ICPR and the Commonwealth Fellowship. His works include Greek philosophy, Hail's to Socrates, and poetry and politics in ancient Greece. Professor Tankha is currently working on Greek philosophy, Greek tragedy as philosophy, and a commentary on Plato's Republic. Over to you, Professor Tankha.
Thank you. So is this audible? Well, thank you very much for the HSS. What is HSS? Humanities and Social Sciences Department for particularly and especially to Ananda Abal and of course I'm a former colleague in St. Stephen's. And this is, of course, my second time here, and it's really a pleasure. Last time I, in fact, talked about poetry and politics, which subsequently I published as a book. Perhaps I've already published it, then I don't know. And so today my talk is a little mixed on care of the self. And it's subtitled Ethics and Politics in Plato. And here's a spoiler alert. The spoiler alert, which may not come out clearly in the course of this rambling paper, is that, especially in Plato, but elsewhere also, as we see, ethics is politics. There's no such thing as ethics. So that's the line that I'm taking with this reading of Plato, starting with, of course, with Socrates. And the idea that care of the self, especially in Socrates, is a practical activity. It's not merely, but we see that there is a kind of between the practice of philosophy as care, as looking after the self, and also the activity, the theoretical activity of doing philosophy as part of investigative procedure. And currently, ethics is, philosophical teachers and experts pay less attention to the importance of the need for ethical practice as a kind of complement or even as necessary for theorizing about ethics. That is, to put it bluntly, you could be an expert in ethics like someone like R.M. Hare or Angier or Bertrand Russell, as they described him. He had the mind of a genius of the morals of an alley cat. So there's no contradiction that you could contribute significantly to the development of philosophical ethics, and your personal ethics may be a complete, not on the table. This is not so, especially in ancient times where what you thought, what you believed had to inform your practice to the extent that we have seen that even Aristotle tells us that a philosopher by the name of Cratylus, who was a follower of Heraclitus, and Heraclitus was understood as saying all things are in flux. So Cratylus stopped speaking because he realized that if you speak, by the time you name something, it has changed. So he would only point to things. That is, he took it very seriously. Another such follower of Parmenides, Lycophron, again according to Aristotle, because the master, Parmenides, had said only the one is. Lycophron stopped using the verb is as a connector because it might show that something was more than one if you connect two things. So, he would revise his own way of speech and language. Yes. So this is really like this guy. Thank you.
Shall I make it? Really sure?
Yeah, sorry. 11 o'clock, the pizza will come. Okay, so let's go to Socrates. And of course, there was philosophy in Greece before Socrates, but Socrates is the person who is seen as introducing, as bringing philosophy to the Greeks. And what does Socrates say? He has a mission, and he describes this mission as persuading you, young and old, not to care for your bodies or possessions before or as much as your souls, to make them as good as possible. So, this is his professed aim of what he had to do, and this is recorded by Plato in a dialogue called the Apology. It's not even a dialogue, it's Socrates' defense speech before his execution. So it's a record of the trial of Socrates. It's quite an important historical document. How faithful it is to the facts, we can never be certain. But that's another question. We can do that. So the entire discipline of ethics in Western philosophy is inaugurated, as it were, by this remark. Because until now, philosophers have paid less attention to questions of morality and conduct, and certainly the idea that the soul was the recipient or the active player in ethics and even in society was still, be under formulation. So our task here will not be to reconstruct the historical antecedents of his claim, but how this claim was understood and the sort of answers it prompted. Something in the spirit of the Socratic search might still give us an insight of how a specifically philosophical stance may yet determine how we direct our lives. So, following the dominant interpretation, we can distinguish chronologically the entire Platonic corpus into three broad streams. This is just by way of introduction. You have what are called the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and the late dialogues. And typically, Socrates occupies prime position in the early dialogues. And sometimes what Socrates says in these early dialogues is taken to be part of the core of actual historical Socratic belief. There's a problem here, how much of Socrates is really Plato. But certainly by the middle dialogues, it's a Platonic voice that is speaking. And Socrates becomes a mouthpiece for doctrines that he neither held nor could have held, because they're far more sophisticated and so on. But the early dialogues are all end in what is called aporia, or difficulties. That is, there's a question asked, some answers are given, and at the end, people say, well, what's the right answer? Nobody knows. So they end in a kind of difficulty. And we'll see how that difficulty ties up with these Socratic claims. So what are the care of the self? So what does he mean by care of the self? Okay, so this is the 24 or 29 dialogues, Socratic, Platonic, critical. So what are the Socratic claims? I mean, there are several others. One is that one must care for oneself. We've seen that. And the other is the unexamined life is not worth living. So what does he mean by the unexamined life? And we may add a third one, which I'm going to come to in a little while, which is the Delphic injunction, know thyself. So the words know thyself in Greek were supposedly written at the entrance to the temple of Apollo at Delphi. And it's a very important, it's like a Mahavakya, know thyself. what it exactly meant at that time and what Plato took it to mean, there are some differences, and we'll see. So, the importance of examination of one's own life is emphasized by Socrates. And to examine oneself is also to import into a philosophical practice the vocabulary of medicine and of law. Because as we'll see also, medicine also after all examines and looks at the body and tries to cure it. And law also, in the way in which law was practiced in ancient times, examination of witnesses. You examine evidence and so on and so forth. And in both cases, and we'll see how Plato uses some of these ideas to construct a way of looking at the relationship between the individual and the city to which he belongs, or to the state. Now, Socrates tells us what he thinks care of the self minimally involves. It involves paying attention to what is important for the soul and not paying attention to what is adventitious or unimportant. And in the Apology, he explicitly excludes as unimportant, and no prizes for guessing what is unimportant, but the usual things that men pursue: power, wealth, status, fame, all these things which were very much part of the Greek outlook of what was desirable for a person, to be successful in politics, to be a hero, to have your name flashed. Even today, after all, these are aims that people pursue. Philosophers or like Socrates, philosophers set themselves against these common outlooks. Okay, so care of the self is therefore not narrowly understood as looking after one's own interests, but in an expanded self of in an expanded sense of what is in your interest. What is really advantageous is what is beneficial for the soul. So the understanding now of care of the self has to take into account the nature of the self that has to be taken care of. So the question now becomes, how should one live? How do you conduct your life? And what is the best way to live? These are Socratic questions. And there are these questions to which he thought philosophy was the only discipline that could answer these questions. And it wasn't something that other people could even ask or give solutions to. And in a sense, the practice of philosophy was the answer to the question of how one should live. That is, you should live by doing philosophy. And what does philosophy involve? It involves examining how your life is being lived. And there are various modern elucidations of this idea of living authentically, of focusing on being mindful of what you're doing, and making the right choices, examining your motivations, meditation. All these are practices that were very common to not only early Greek philosophers. Socrates, for instance, often goes into deep deliberations while walking. He suddenly will stop and start thinking. And there's a report of him that before the Battle of Delium, he stands for a whole night, lost in thought. So this is what is called autonomous living, rather than, as Kant says, heteronomous living. And such living exhibits the hallmark of the Socratic demand that we place ourselves under scrutiny. Now, what was the Socratic question? So Socrates was famous for going around asking people questions in the marketplace. Questions to which they thought they had answers, which they were unable to answer when he examined their answers. And therefore, they were shown to be ignorant of what they ought to have known. So for example, in some of the early dialogues that are written by Plato, you have Socrates going in one dialogue, he meets two generals, two famous, and these are living persons, all persons that Socrates interacts with in the Platonic dialogues were real historical figures, almost without exception. So he asked these two generals the meaning of courage, which as army men they should have been able to answer. Of course, they can't answer, and again are shown ignorant. Socrates thinks in the Apology, Plato writes that perhaps this was the reason why he was condemned because he irritated a lot of people, especially important people that showed people that they didn't know what they were talking about. Now, the crucial feature of the Socratic question is that he himself offered no answer to the question. So it wasn't as if he asked the question and the other person would say something and he said, no, that's not right for this reason, and then they would turn around and say, well, Socrates, you tell us what it is that he's losing for them. I don't know. So Socratic ignorance has, became a hallmark of a special kind of wisdom. One is wise who knows that he does not know. The other aspect of the Socratic search for knowledge is that it was carried out in the public sphere, open marketplace. He met people in the marketplace and stung them with his questions. This is an image, the stinging image is one that is used in the apology itself. Here it is. Okay. Oh, I haven't got that. So here's the quote. If you put me to death, you will not easily find another man attached to you by the will of the gods, in order to stimulate you like a horsefly stimulates a horse. It would sting people, and people would describe in some of the dialogues, he's described as the effect that he has on people is that they get paralyzed. And he's compared to a fish, this little kind of fish that he's compared to at some point, which just paralyzes with sting. So Socrates' concern, that is not simply with himself, but with others. And care of the self for him is an exercise in care and concern for others. That's public nature of the Socratic practice. The ephemeria eautou, care of oneself, is an attitude towards the self, world, and others. And the Socratic questioning is to make people aware of their own ignorance, of what they should in fact know, and something that then becomes the basis for acquiring knowledge. You have to first admit that you don't know whatever it is that you are. Now, what is it that they are ignorant of? Now, here's the beauty of the Platonic dialogue. Plato doesn't tell us directly. So, in the Phaedrus, Socrates says that he does not, Phaedrus is the late dialogue, and we come to it later, says that he does not really know what he's really like, leading us to suppose that Socrates does not know himself, and that therefore he is recommending self-knowledge as an answer to the question, as the most important aim of philosophical examination. And if so, it would be in keeping with the great saying in the Temple of Apollo. Now, its original meaning, as interpreted by scholars, was very different from the kind of meaning that Plato gives it. Originally, one of the senses of know thyself was literally know your place. Don't presume too much. Don't get too big for your boots. You're only human. Don't try to compare yourself to the gods. Appropriate, before a temple, particularly to a god like Apollo, and the Greek gods were rather jealous of their own preserve, and mortals who dared to presume that they could act or be as good as gods were immediately punished. I mean, for instance, there are many such stories. One centaur, Marsyas, challenges Apollo to a lyre playing competition. Apollo doesn't deign to actually compete with the lyre, but the temerity of this, and he's a demigod, centaur, the temerity of somebody asking this, he flays him alive and makes a wineskin out of his skin, a wineskin bag, merely for daring to ask him. And there are other such, examples of mortal women, comparing themselves to God Progene or somebody, who are punished in horrible ways. So know thyself could simply be a cautionary thing. Don't try to emulate the gods. But that's not the Platonic. So, okay. I think this is the wrong thing. Yeah, this is the wrong. There's some other. So in another dialogue, the first Alcibiades, he who enjoins knowledge of oneself bids us to become acquainted with the soul. So self-knowledge now is by Plato positioned as the object of the philosopher's search. What is self-knowledge? It is to know what the soul is really like. In order to take care of oneself, one must first know what is the self. Now, Socrates was not, at least the historical Socrates, there's no belief in the immortality of the soul, which was, by the way, alien to early Greek thought. The idea that mortals were not immortal, that was what made them mortal. And they were different from the gods. So the idea of immortality is a later arrival, perhaps with the Greek influence or some Eastern influence. It comes in Plato, it comes in the Pythagoreans, but it's not part of mainstream Greek thinking. Even in Aristotle, there is no immortality of the soul. There are certain lives that are lived, there are gods, and there are mortals. So the distinction is clear. So Socrates is not necessarily committed to some postmortem existence, which is why his ethics does not need to appeal to the gods. There's no salvation at the end of it, that if you do good, then you'll be rewarded. That picture doesn't appear. Simply the virtue, as it were, is its own reward. So what is, virtue of the soul. So the aim of looking after the self is to espouse virtue. It's a call to virtue, as they call it. And virtue is the best condition of the soul. So this is Socrates saying, this is what I tell you, that virtue is not derived from wealth, but that virtue is itself the source of wealth and all other goods, both for the individual and for the state. Now he actually says that you'll be better off. And this is a very powerful argument for morality. Many people have tried to make this, that you will be better off right now, not just postmortem rewards, but in life itself, if you are honest. Say, honesty is a virtue. Kant, of course, rejects that your motivation, if you're trying to be honest in order to get a business, it's a shopkeeper's mentality, and that's not really virtuous. But the idea that virtue is beneficial to the individual is not something that straightforwardly appeals to everybody, but it's a powerful argument. If you could show that all truth tellers always do well in life and the liars are always found out, then if this could actually be believed, but actually we find that there is the opposite. There's things like the problem of evil. The rogues and the scoundrels are more successful than the honest men, and this is repeated in the Republic. Early in the Republic, these questions are asked. So what is it that Socrates thinks? The virtuous will not be rewarded by the gods for their good conduct. There's no appeal to the gods. And this makes it actually quite interesting that Socrates, although he's not an atheist, claims that virtue is both beneficial as well as valuable to the individual because of the nature of virtue. And further, and this is important, care of the self is not simply beneficial for the individual, it's necessary for society. And here again, I have a quote from Alcibiades, which is not here.
But you want to put up the other slide, do you think that would be better?
Maybe it's in the other one. I don't know whether we can start switch horses midstream now. I'll continue, there are a few such things that I'll just read out. So in the first Alcibiades, again, it's a single line. If a state, that is a city, polis, or any office is lacking in virtue, it will be overtaken by failure. And this is important. Why? Because for Plato, as we'll see, it is necessary for the individual to be virtuous in order for him to effectively govern other individuals. That is, the subject has to make some effort, maybe a lot of effort, in order to gain the kind of knowledge that is required in order to do. So that's why I said the ethics and the politics are actually very closely aligned. And this will, I hope, come out. Now, there's a problem, of course, like all things, the term that is translated as virtue doesn't really mean what we mean by virtue. Not necessarily. So, The word is arete, and it generally means excellence. So you can have the arete of a horse, which is running well, the arete of a knife, which is cutting well, a functional excellence, if you like. But Socrates takes this as a moral category. So the typical virtues are what are called the cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. I've left justice out. Oh, courage came in twice. See, this is the wrong slide. So wisdom, courage, temperance, justice, or justice, wisdom, courage, temperance, depending on the order. These are called the cardinal virtues. They become very important in the Republic and have a long afterlife because of the influence of Plato. Now, what is virtue? We still don't know that. These are the virtues. Socrates then undermines his case, if you like, by saying that virtue is knowledge. The only virtue is knowledge. And I deliberately put wealth, health, and other virtues, good fortune, in small letters to show that compared to knowledge, they are completely unimportant. You may be unhealthy, you may be poor, you may be unlucky, all of which Aristotle, by the way, thinks, rightly so, I think, as being very important components of the good life. That a person without luck, a person without some wealth is not going to live an enviable life. But Aristotle was much more pragmatic then. So we have another paradox, and this is why the early dialogues and Socratic writings, Platonic writings about Socrates are full of problems, and we'll come and time left. So, why should virtue as knowledge be paradoxical? Because we know that knowledge of some sort is necessary to use anything properly. If you can't count properly, you won't be a good keeper of money, and so on and so forth. That's not the kind of knowledge. Technical knowledge is not what Socrates means by virtuous knowledge. He has some other kind of knowledge in mind. Again, with Platonic writing, we are not told directly what this knowledge is. So we early dialogue with no clarity. So there are various claims, and maybe Socrates is giving too intellectual version. This is a common modern interpretation that you have to have some kind of specialist knowledge in order to be virtuous. So he's accused of intellectualism. Aristotle accuses him of intellectualism. That in order to know something, you should be able to define it. And since in the early dialogues, nobody is able to define, they don't. So I think you have a very, very strong sense or meaning of the word knowledge, in which most people are excluded from it. And we'll see there is a certain truth to that. But he distinguishes between technical knowledge and moral. So technical knowledge of how to do things, for which he has another word, that is not what qualifies as moral knowledge. What could moral knowledge be? Well, one candidate that has been offered as moral knowledge is knowledge of good and evil. That is, if you know what is good and if you know what is evil, then you will have a criterion which will be able to distinguish between them, and that's the kind of knowledge you need. Of course, this is again not explicitly stated, and it looks rather trite that maybe, what does this really tell us about the good and evil? We don't know. But I came across this once reading.
Okay, so I will change the slides because otherwise your quotes are.
No, this is all right.
Oh, this is fine.
So here's from the Book of Kings, Wisdom of Solomon. What does Solomon ask God for? He asks for an understanding that I may discern between good and evil. If you have that that's real wisdom. So maybe there is some truth in the possibility that knowledge means knowledge of good and evil. But as I said, it's not explicitly stated. And there may be good reasons for that, some which we may be able to touch upon. Okay. So Socrates often argues that being virtuous is the only way in which I can bestow care on the self. But by identifying virtue exclusively with knowledge, he seems to have isolated a single strand in the makeup of individuals, without which one cannot actually care for oneself. The emphasis on thinking, or what will later be called reason, will become central in Plato's work. So now we move to reason.
You're halfway through as well.
And I'm just about
That's
halfway
perfect.
through. So the word is logos, and you get all the ologies come from logos, biology, philology, and so on. The study of or the knowledge of. And logos is this word which means almost everything. Here, of course, I'm limited to speech, argument, reason, but it can also mean money, it can mean speech, it can mean word. John 1:1 in the beginning was the word. He uses the word logos. Logos is the word. And from Heraclitus onwards, this word becomes increasingly important in Greek thought. So much so that you now have this word logocentrism, that unnecessary positioning of the logos, of definitions, demarcations, and so on, where there are no such things. Anyway, so this is a word on which people no doubt have written books, and if they haven't, they should be writing them. So there is no single word which designates reason. This is sometimes used, as we see there is a variation in this. So logismos is another word that is used, has two basic meanings. It has a narrow meaning of counting or numerical calculation. This is important, as we see, and you get this in early Pythagoreanism as well. And in this sense is often paired with number. The word for number is arithmos. But there is a more general sense of logos as the exercise of logismos, as the exercise of reason in rational inference and thought. So logos is aligned with thinking, thought, rationality, and ultimately will give us some idea, something that is akin to reason. Now, there is a well-known funeral oration written by the historian Thucydides, in which Pericles gives this speech about the greatness of the Athenians. I just touched upon that. And in this funeral, Pericles refers to the rational calculations which the Athenians use in evaluating risks of an action, and which produces hesitation in other states, but not in Pericles' Athens. That is, we Athenians know how to think ahead, and we're energetic and active, and other people lack this kind of enterprising spirit that we have. While logismos and its derivatives refer to the ability of forward thinking and calculation that characterizes effective thinking, there is nothing as yet that corresponds to a defining feature of men in general. Indeed, in Thucydides, forward thinking and planning is a feature peculiar to Athenians and is concerned with working out where one's future advantage really lies. Now, Socratic examination demands a defense of the beliefs one holds, and this defense demands skill in argument. It is in this sense that reason seems to play a role in the works of Plato. That is, you give reasons. You are asked to defend your position, and the word that is used or the formula that is used is to give a reason, is to give a logos. Give me the logos. What's your explanation? Defend it. So logon didonai is to give the reason. It's almost like, it's very similar to a juridical term, to pay the penalty. And there is a connection again between the sort of legal terminology and the philosophical terminology that Plato is inventing to some extent. Okay. Now, I want to move to the connection between the rational and the irrational. And of course, there is the body and soul distinction, which is familiar across the board to everybody. Everybody knows, oh, soul is this, body is that. You find this in many systems. This is also an invention of the philosophers. There is no self-evidence about exactly what the nature of the body is and what the nature of the soul is. And this is, as we'll see, although it occurs in many ancient cultures, it's not as self-evident as we might think it is. There are several different divisions that are used that use these aspects and merit detailed consideration. While the body is characterized as a tomb for the soul, this is a well-known Orphic doctrine, the body is also seen as what is moved by the soul. So you have the animator, the soul is the animator. There are different ways in which the relationship between body and soul are characterized. Minimally, the soul is the principle of life, and this goes back also to movement, much later to consciousness, connected much later with mind. So you have a whole, and again, from the Alcibiades, I can quote, since neither the body nor the combination of the two, that is body plus soul, is man, we are reduced to this. Either man is nothing at all, or he turns out to be nothing else than soul. So increasingly, the human being is to be identified not with the body, but with the soul. And in the Gorgias, Plato distinguishes crafts that nurture to the body and those that give nurture to the soul. And the crafts that give nurture to the body are obviously medicine. And what gives nurture to the soul? Politics. And politics is divided into that which treats the soul in the way in which medicine treats the body, and that is justice. And legislation, that is lawmaking, treats the soul prospectively, what is good for the soul. So you get a mix of the society, legislation, the individual. Both of them are administered, but it is the soul in both cases, whether it belongs to the city or whether it belongs to the individual. And note that what is devalued is not just the body, but everything associated with it. It's used as an umbrella term for a whole class of objects, activities, even motivations, which are subsumed, and they can be collectively seen to represent the world as a whole. You get the same distinction in Indian thought when they talk about log. What is belongs to the world doesn't belong to reality. Reality is the self or atma. So the separation of the body and soul rejects not only the body, but an expanded idea of the physical. And in deliberate opposition to Greek cultural practices, which were in fact celebrated the physicality, the games, the contests, the depiction of beautiful bodily form in the sculpture, and so on, all the living aspect of life. And for the purposes of the analogy between body and soul, it is enough to say that the body suffers from disease. So there must be a disease of the soul that corresponds to it. And what is that? It is injustice. So justice is the good condition of the soul, injustice is the bad, and it's a corresponding disease that destroys the soul. Of course, again, it is a political understanding of what justice is. And so if virtue is knowledge, then ignorance must be vice. So vice is just somebody misguided. He doesn't know what is really in his own interest and therefore commits for whatever reason. So we can see how Plato makes use of popular ideas, some of whose formulations he adopts and interprets until they come and mean something unexpected and new, and yet seem to have been drawn naturally from everyday distinctions. The distinction between body and soul is a prime example of how Plato transforms a common conception to provide him with a new way of defining the new knowledge practice that he calls philosophy. And here is another. Philosophy is a preparation for death, and the Phaedo says as much. Welcoming death is again a reversal of the heroic conception of life as being that which is to be lived, celebrated, enjoyed, and now death is suddenly valued and life is devalued. So, and the body is, of course, associated with life, and welcoming death is also, of course, anti-heroic. And one possible consequence of this is pessimism about the world. The other is asceticism. And we see that the ascetic part informs the way in which Plato looks at the philosopher and the role that the philosopher has to play in the life of. Okay, then there is a medical analogy. So along with the separation of body and soul, Plato suggests each of them is the subject of a particular art. And the analogy with medicine sees the philosopher as a doctor of the soul. This is again important because the medical analogy is used in a way in which, you see, the relationship between the doctor and the patient, if it's taken as an analog for the relationship between the citizen and the state, then just as the patient must obey what the doctor tells him for his own good, being ignorant, unlike the doctor, the citizen must obey the rulers who will tell him what to do for his own good. So justice is a kind of medicine that is given to the citizen patient. So here you have again, this is what I'm leading to, the sort of anti-democratic, aristocratic politics of Plato and how he marshals these ethical concepts to provide him with an argument which is essentially anti-democratic. Okay. And there are various ways in which the medical analogy can be used. It underscores the concern. After all, doctor is not doing this for his own sake, he's doing it for the patient's sake, and so on and so forth. It's not a policeman analogy yet, but get those also. And Socrates' association with the young, contrary to the charge against him, he was accused of corrupting the young. So instead, he's shown as somebody who is actually concerned with the state of their souls. So the Socratic practice of philosophy consists not so much as imparting true beliefs to others, but as helping them to bring out their own beliefs. So because he's ignorant, he does not actually impart anything. He doesn't tell people about it. There are no homilies, be good, be nice to your friends. There's a question about what is it to be nice to someone? What is it to do good to someone? And then there's a discussion. So the idea is that Socrates extracts from a person his own beliefs and either shows the inadequacy of those beliefs and helps him to realize and to achieve getting the right ones. In a late dialogue, the Theaetetus, the Socratic practice is described as midwifery. Socrates is like a midwife who cannot bring children herself, but helps other people to deliver their ideas. Ideas are children. So here you get the idea of a male pregnancy, that males can be pregnant too, this time with ideas. And these ideas are actually much longer living than offspring. These are really the way in which an individual, philosophers in this case, can become immortal by engendering beautiful ideas. And in the symposium, the best kind of offspring are described as beautiful or noble ideas engendered by the cooperative and passionate association of teacher and taught as lover and beloved. Here again, Plato has taken a well-known cultural practice, the initiation of young men into civic life, in the form of an erotic association, and cast it as a metaphor for philosophy. I don't think he would have got through, these days with harassment charges and other things, So what is important about Socratic conversational mode is that it draws on the intellectual abilities of the person, and the knowledge is sort of brought out from that. So what is important is, of course, discussion, the therapy of the word, the philosophical conversations are a cure for ignorance, and the place of argument. So discussion is very important. And it forces men by means of arguments or reasons to confess error or to recognize the truth, as contrasted with the narration of an enchanting myth, which is able to persuade the favorable acceptance of that which can actually be believed. Now later we'll see very briefly that Plato will combine both these methods. And usually, in the sort of standard analytic philosophical approach to Plato, people will only look at the arguments and ignore the myths. Others will only look at the myths and ignore the arguments. But Plato uses both. And for very important reasons, political reasons, which I will touch upon if I can soon enough. Okay, so let's just. And there is no mercy when he says that a man could suffer than this hating arguments. People come to hate arguments because they find that the एक argument है तो दूसरी counter argument है. How long are you going to go on arguing? Masti karo. So there is a natural tendency to say, okay, enough. This is bakwas band karo. That is kind of thing. But he warns us against that. And he says that don't regard Socrates if he's not. The truth is much more important. It's not important who speaks. What is important is whether it's true or not. So you have to resist arguments with more arguments. Now, what is happening is, there is an old dichotomy. This was the thought I had last night. There was an old dichotomy, and we'd see that in Plato also, between force, violence, force, and persuasion. You see it in the tragedians and others. That how to convince somebody, either you twist his arm or you persuade him as a goal. Reason seems to be replacing force because the language of logic suggests things like necessity. You have to accept. If you accept this, then this follows. you can't deny it, and so on and so forth. So the force of an argument is a kind of way of convincing people, but it's not always effective. Plato recognizes that, and therefore he writes also persuasive imagery, myths, and the Republic is of course full of them. This maps onto another distinction, which was current at the time, between the active and the contemplative. So, with the body and soul bifurcated, it provided ground for an epistemological contrast between sense and reason on the one hand, and a contrast between the active and the contemplative life on another plane. And you get this very clearly in Aristotle. So, what is the best kind of life? The active life of the citizen, one who lives in a polis, politics. Citizen must be active, he must participate in the day-to-day running of his own city. But there is another kind of life. In the last book, the best kind of life, Aristotle says, is the contemplative life, because that is divine. It's like God-like. That's what God does. He contemplates, he doesn't act. So Aristotle doesn't tell you which is better. He just leaves these two, the active and the contemplative, as two different ideals. And then you must choose between them. And I think he's also following Plato, because in the Republic, the philosopher, when he goes out of the cave of the world and encounters the beauty of reality, a bit like this garden full of flowers out here, and then he looks at all that, he says, why the hell should I go back into the classroom now when I can do this class? But he's forced to, because duty calls and so on and so forth. So between the contrast between the active political life and the contemplative philosophical life, ultimately will propose that the contemplative life is more divine and it's more godlike. And that is the life that one should follow. And this continues the separation of the soul and the body. So the rational part of the soul, as it were, looks at abstract ideas, and the non-rational part, which is bodily, has the feelings and the appetites. And they're described as a mass of desires and things, much like the mass of people who have all kinds of desires, all kinds of opinions, and they don't have any knowledge. Knowledge can only be gained by those with the rational law. And again, there are early quotes, again from Alcibiades, one which I got on this PowerPoint, my fault. And he says here, and farmers and craftsmen are far from knowing themselves, since they know but things of the body. It includes doctors and other practitioners of the technical arts. So if knowledge of oneself is virtue, sophos you may, none of these are temperate. None of these are virtuous. Farmers, craftsmen, in respect to his art. And that is why these arts are held to be sordid and not things that are to be learned by a good man. So you now have this idea that okay. Now this was a standard thing at this time, how to criticize democracy. And this is not Plato, but this is somebody over writing about it. It's a central problem for classical Athenian intellectuals.
Beethoven's fifth doesn't like you criticizing justice.
These women. By the end of the 5th century, it becomes the central problem. So, here's another one. Because, and this ties up with the Alcibiades quote, this is also Plato's opinion, because among the best people there is minimum wantonness and injustice, but a maximum of scrupulous care for what is good. Whereas among the common people there is a maximum of ignorance, disorder, and wickedness. Aam Janta is not fit to do that. That's really the summary. So who is supposed to rule? Okay, just read the last line. Again, self-knowledge. Sharing in my nature some divine and untyphonic bond. That is, this is the famous quote about the nature of the self. I don't know myself, as the Delphic inscription puts it.
It's the last 10 minutes. Shall I just put the other slide? It doesn't matter. Otherwise,
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of quotes.
Yeah, exactly. I think we continue with that. You can talk about other things.
Okay. Yeah, but you see, now it belongs to the rational part to do. The rational part rules the body, and the rational ruler must rule the body politic. So the relationship is analogous, just as for your own, what is it called? Harmonious organization of the internal contradictions of reason and appetite and desires and feelings and calculation. The reason must rule in the individual. Similarly, reason must rule in the body politic. And it must persuade there are two ways of persuading your desires to keep under control. One is to harmonize them, to persuade them, and the other is to use force. Starve yourself, go into some rehab program or something,
They're both the same. So
They're both the same. And how would that be? Anyway, it's all right.
Yeah.
So the ruling principle, I'll have to skip this about Stasis and Aeschylus and things, but anyway.
yeah, it'll come back.
All right. So what Plato wants to achieve is the kind of condition of unity in the individual unity of the state. And this unity means ruling out all kinds of conflict, all kinds of opposition. And the word for opposition that is used, which is used for factions, is the word stasis. It comes with the word stance, which is similar, taking a stand. And politically, different people would take different ideological stands. But he saw this as essentially destructive of the harmonious working of different parts. Just as the body, the appetites need to be controlled. If you eat too much sugary food, you will get diabetes. And if you get diabetes, it will impede your, it's not in your interest. So if you have a craving for sugar, you either go into some, place where they force you not to have these things, you go into care, or you pay the price. So like disease for the body, there are diseases for the soul. And only the person who knows how to fix these diseases is competent to tell you what to do. So citizens will be forced and persuaded. Ultimately, they will be coerced into accepting the fact that they don't know, because they are ignorant. They don't. So you have another sense of the word reason. And two tasks for philosophers. Its theoretical aim is to improve the cognitive capacities of men. That is true. But there is a limit to which you can improve these cognitive capacities. And its practical aim is to make everyone as happy as possible by making them just. So that is this thing. But there are two senses of reason that are in operation here. One is the instrumental reason, which simply calculates means to end. And in the Republic, you get that kind of reason up till the middle of the book 4, when the whole state and its organization has all been completed and justice has been defined as a harmony between the opposing elements of reason and appetite, which have been harmonized, and the soul has now been, sort of fixed. But subsequently, you get what is called the higher education of the philosopher. And in this higher education of the philosopher, you get a new sense of reason which alone can grasp ends, the hierarchy of goods. This is not available to everybody. And this is what distinguishes the people, the mass, from the rulers. So the ethics is really to provide a ground and an explanation for the politics. This is it? Okay. Yeah, I'll just read some of this. Now, the rational part is destroyed, he says, by those who appeal, as poets do, poets, painters, by those who appeal to the inferior part, inferior or irrational part. The poet stimulates and fosters this irrational element in the soul. And by strengthening it, it tends to destroy the rational part, just as in a state. One puts bad men in power and turns the city over to them and ruins the state. So all of art is criticized, but poets more generally meant artists in general. The poets were, if you like, the media of the times. So the media of the times, or the people talking about, differences, unhappiness, or tragedies, or whatever, they're appealing to the irrational. They're not using arguments, they're using images, they're using poetic language, and they are therefore undermining reason. And ultimately what Plato will do is replace the excellent literature with philosophical literature, with didactic literature, a bit like the Soviet program. You teach people to be good, you tell them what to do. And your literature must conform with the ideals of your state. It's a paternalistic state. Because you're claiming that you're doing this for the good of the people. The people cannot do it for themselves. So this is the two senses of reason that we get. And philosophy as dialectic, or Socratic dialectic, cares for the self by leading it away from its usual mundane concerns. And by negatively showing that ordinary discourse is not well-rounded, it uncovers the epistemic condition of man as one who lacks knowledge, but at the same time pronounces him as capable. This is the Socratic practice. If one were to suppose that the Socratic dialectic provides a model of self-questioning as the proper means of self-knowledge, a questioning that gives substance to his claim that the unexamined life is not worth living, then we can see philosophy as the exercise of reason as a way of defining oneself. By identifying reason as that which takes care of the whole person, philosophy defines man as the rational animal, meaning by this perhaps no more than that man can choose and act in his own interest. By argumentatively appealing to such instrumental rationality, philosophy suggests that all men are capable of grasping what is in their own interest. But this goal of philosophy is somewhat at odds with the result of the negative dialectic, which has shown most, if not all men, to be wallowing in ignorance. The solution to this conflict is to suppose that while all men are capable of instrumental reason, applying means to end, they are largely incapable of grasping the natural hierarchy of things. Higher reason, the province of the few alone is capable of this, and that to which much effort and training. The task of philosophy then is to identify and train such persons who can order society in such a way that they enable others to live happily as possible. Higher reason is stimulated and developed by the study of mathematics and theoretical, non-empirical subjects, where the mind makes no use of the senses at all. This enables some to abandon entirely the use of the senses and purely by an intellectual effort grasp those abstract objects that alone are stable. It is this cognitive capability of men which defines them. All men are mortal, only some are rational. Thank you.
Your image has disappeared, but we'll fix that. Why don't you take a seat while I ask you questions back? I thought this was with wheels. I was obviously not. No, but can we'll fix the camera? Can somebody ask them what's going on with the camera? Because people are online and we have questions. Yeah, Mike. Yeah, but can somebody go and ask about this camera? What's going on?
I think anyway. I'm sorry about the slides.
Yeah, it's slides. No worries. You manage.
I thought I sent you the right one. Yeah, the slides didn't work. That pizza didn't turn up either.
Can who's going to ask?
I must warn everybody that, or advise everybody that, like Socrates, I only ask, I don't answer questions. So,
thank you so much, Professor Tankha, for the wonderful talk. So my question is more than, like I'm not from philosophy, so it may be a little, spread over basically. So one very interesting aspect you mentioned is that how Socrates used to go around in the public sphere to generate certain kind of knowledge, of course, to which he himself did not have the answer. Now, another aspect of knowledge is also this yeah, this notion of, knowledge about oneself, which is gained through introspection more than, in the public sphere all the time. And we also have this idea that the more one shares knowledge, knowledge grows. So the notion of knowledge has this very, I think, diverse and sort of varied sort of, intention and definition also. So I was wondering if you could say that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because this is part of the problem and part of the excitement of the Platonic dialogues is that they don't offer, at least these early ones, they don't offer, it's very difficult to summarize. In the sense, you can't say, well, this is the purport of the dialogue, because the dialogue has led you into different directions and sometimes which contradict each other. And there have been whole schools of thought that have tried to say that there is a hidden answer in each dialogue and you have to search and find it. And it involves a lot of direct activity on your part. I think one of these dialogues I mentioned, I didn't read it out, I mentioned this here, is in the symposium, Socrates remarks almost as an aside that it would be wonderful if you could transmit knowledge by touch. If somebody could simply touch somebody and then he would become, which some of our seers are supposed to be able to do, give us wo haath lagaya, Ram Krishna ne but that's not the kind of, so Socrates says that knowledge cannot be given from one person to another. So it's not technical expertise. I can show you how to, maybe run the PowerPoint and not, or how to do a technical this thing or refix your computer and so on and so forth. That's not the technical knowledge that, so it is only moral knowledge initially that Socrates is concerned with, that morality itself and these virtues are excellences, which excellences, why are they excellent, how do they help a person, how are they, what use are they? So even in technical knowledge, you have, for instance, there's a story of the Buddha where he meets a yogi who's been doing tapasya or yogic practices for 10, 15 years and says that now I can walk on water and I can cross the river. And the Buddha says, you're wasting your time. I can take a boat and just go across. Why are you doing this? And so, technical knowledge is not, it's important, it's part of the worldly affair. But this idea that there is something, and it's not just knowledge of God. It's like divine knowledge. It's like becoming like what God knows or what, maybe it has the form of God. Again, the philosophers are very vague, naturally, of it, of what exactly Plato describes the form of the good, which Socrates said that, look, I can't tell you what it is because I haven't, I can only give you some images of it. So you cannot grasp that which is in a sense not graspable by the mind except through images. So images do play a role, but they're not as good as arguments. So, I mean, it's speculative as to what is the knowledge that one should seek when one is saying, looking at self-knowledge. What is it that you want to know? What is it that you want to find out? And I think you have a long tradition, which goes back to the Greeks through Freud and others, through psychoanalysis, of coming to, as it were, understanding oneself and one's motivations, as looking at your, and that knowledge is liberating. At least in psychoanalysis, if you confront whatever it is, your trauma that was hidden behind, buried in your unconscious, if you can confront it, then it disappears. It's like a ghost. Get rid of. I don't know, I probably didn't answer the question, so fill the time.
There are lots of questions, but should I ask the Zoom question or? There's one Zoom question. So, and then I'll hand it over because I'm trying to stay away from, the camera is not there, so it's like it shows my head. So.
I should be looking there then.
No, you are fine. Oh God, thank you. Wait. Yeah, so yeah, there's a question. Let's read the time on the screen. Okay, so it's from Orku. He's thanking you for such a layered and comprehensive talk. Could you speak a bit more about the status of duality in Plato? I have two specific questions in this direction. Does the body-soul division make him a dualist? And is there a way of reading the body back into Plato? Tough question.
Yeah, I'll have to take that as an advisement, you know.
Can I ask?
Yeah. So,
please, if there's a similar question.
Mic to Varun.
I mean, just skipping the
Yes.
queue. Right?
Somebody should move that.
Yeah. No, I had a similar question since Orko asked, and well, which is quite deep-seated in the conversation that you mentioned that like how it's in fact the division between the body and the soul, which is a seed of all of this. In fact, like what should be ethics, what should be in the world, and the division between philosophy and medicine, etc., etc. And I was also thinking parallelly is that how it happens in other traditions, and of course the permanence of soul and the perishable body seems to be a kind of a common starting point for most of the traditions. Let's say even for most of the Indian traditions, which is liberatory in that sense. Let's say which are aiming for liberation at the end of it, which is not the case as you mentioned in the Greek tradition. And surprisingly, they also say the same thing. I mean, like it is the soul which passes on from generation, but life to life, and it is the body which is that, and it is the karmic cycles that we have to cleanse in that sense. But what is also interesting in the South Asian schools of thought that we have seen is that, like, if that is one aspect of it, but the practice of the daily life or the yogic life, in whatever say, or even the philosophers, if you want to call them as philosophers, is that this doesn't seep into the what you say the rationality of the rationalizing the whole system. What do I mean by that is that, like, a system of thought that might be like say the Yoga Sankhya school or even the Buddhist Jainism and all of that, which is hardly a lot of liberatory aspect in that sense. They brought back body in very interesting ways. And they have been brought back not just in the daily practice of it, and that is what has led to the yoga and other forms of bodily practices, but they have been brought back in the philosophical way. When, like, say, the yoga and the Sankhya schools of philosophy, the yoga school of philosophy is basically that, like how to bring in back this bodily aspect back into this rational. I mean, they don't divide it in reasoning and sensing in that sense, but they philosophize that system in that sense. And they take Sankhya's help for Sankhya's ontology to do that. And that is where, like, the parallels that I was trying to draw for how that school of system, the philosophical system is designed and how this is designed in that sense. So one of the questions that I also was thinking is that, like, now, when that is what probably the version of Plato is, version 1 in that sense. And I'm sure there have been Neoplatonists and all of that, and I'm sure there are contemporary Platonists in this room as well.
Most mathematicians.
Mathematicians, I'm just referring to the two of you.
I don't know Platonist.
Yeah. No, I'm just.
There's not a Platonist.
For today, for the talk,
For the talks.
how can we, even, like, how would you want to improvise and bring in body in interesting ways back into it? Because I think it's more important for the question of ethics than anything else. How can we ignore our own body and say it has to be tempered? But to temper is to say that I acknowledge its reality in the first place, more than so of anything that I can deny the reality of.
Yeah, I don't think first of all, to take that your point with the first question about dualism, is that these categories of dualism, monism, pluralism don't actually fit Plato. I mean, you know, if you talk about pluralism, then you might say, well, there are many forms. Aristotle criticizes him on his duplication of the forms or abstract ideas. If you take a realist metaphysics or try to read him as a realist, and then there are some forms which is not necessary. So, you know, is he a dualist about body and soul? Well, there are bodies, he doesn't deny the reality of the bodies, nor does he deny the reality of the world. So he's not, in fact, idealism is not a sort of feature of Greek thought. That is somehow the world is only constituted by consciousness and its ideas, or that there is some super consciousness that conceives the world. So certainly there is a body, and in fact, I suppose one of the ways he's not denying that bodies need medicine. So and medicine is an important what is the word model for his understanding of the soul. How else will you depict or picture the soul? So far as the body-soul relationship in general is concerned, in Greek thought, the development of ideas of selfhood and soul have a long history, as a well-recorded one also. Much work has been done on it. I mean, to give you a simple example, the only function of the soul in Homer is to leave the body. It has no consciousness, has no, and then of course there are different images. There's no idea of an immortal afterlife. There's no idea of an enviable postmortem existence.
It's terrible, actually. Achilles says that he doesn't want, right? That's the worst thing.
Yeah, the worst thing, because for the heroes, life and feasting and fighting and fame, these are the three sort of components of the good life. Death to sabko milna hai. And I think that it's only with the rise, and you get it with all these other cults, slowly that you have a more democratic idea, because for Aam Janta, feasting and fighting and fame were no-nos. There was no chance of that, you know. So what have you got to look forward to? So you have all these popular cults, Pythagoreanism, the Orphics, offering, you know, some postmortem condition, some life, and then you get this very different kinds of ideas of transmigration, criticized by Plato, philosophically. Transmigration, what does it prove? It only proves that the soul may live longer than the body. Then he talks about how the body is preserved. In Egypt, bodies can be kept alive for a long time. In fact, anyone reading murder mysteries knows just how difficult it is to get rid of a body compared to the soul, you know. I mean, who's looking for the soul? So there is a kind of permanent this thing of the body. But this idea of the body is also takes time to develop. What is in the heroic imagination, the tomb of the warrior, the tomb, the sima, as it's called, the limit, later becomes an image for, in these cults, as that in which the soul is. So the body is a tomb. So the body is your memorial, which is everybody's body, not just the memorial for the hero. So, you know, heroic values are undergoing transformation into more secular values, more cooperative values, and then more democratic values. And it's really the anti-democratic, all the intellectuals of classical Greece were anti-democratic. Thucydides, Euripides, well, Euripides has things to say.
Too blanket statement.
But in general, this is not my statement. This is a statement made by all these hotshot writers on Greek thought.
Yeah, they're not like
it's only later. It's only in the sort of later period when democracy doesn't have direct defenders. It gets the direct defenders later when it's almost on its decline. You know, Demosthenes, the orators, and things. By which time the end of democracy is nigh. You know, there is in fact, a perfect date on which Athenian democracy dies at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. It's not only a date, but a time, 3:23 or 3:1 PC, this thing. On a particular day, August, this thing, it's in my book, but I've forgotten the date now. But at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, democracy dies. Why? Because the combined forces of Thebes and Athens are defeated by Philip of Macedon. And that's the end of Athenian democracy. So, but it lasted 200 years, if not more, 200 plus years, 409 or something. it's only in the democracy that you get the ability of a Socrates to go and hang out in the marketplace criticizing democracy. It's only in a democracy that Plato's republic is set up, I mean, his school is set up, and he attacks democracy through these very, very, well thought out epistemological and metaphysical categories. Because essentially, the epistemology, the idea of knowledge, the idea of truth, the idea that opinions, which is what many people have, doxa, do not give you truth, means that the people cannot access truth. Now, so far as the body-soul separation in Sankhya and others is concerned, I'm not sure just what the politics of the time is, because those texts are very difficult also to date, and you don't know what their immediate connection is. But you get all these metaphors of the necessity of cooperation, the necessity of body and soul to be together, because after all, the body is that which gives you the place for the soul to devolve itself, to return to to its original condition by sublating or by using the body, whether it's in yoga. Ultimately, it's the mind or consciousness of the self which is important. And I think in the Indian tradition, the importance of consciousness as a characteristic of the soul is what corresponds, if you like, to reason in the Greek tradition. We don't have a word for reason in Greek philosophy. Chinese have no word for reason. Reason doesn't define man, but consciousness does. So this is what, this was supposed to lead to, the supposed rationality of man, which the Greeks have given, as it were, to Western thought, is really a political maneuver on the part of its early founders. Rationality in this higher sense of grasping of ends is, and Kant says, what is man but rational? And that nature has given somehow man rationality, which distinguishes. This idea of rationality has a completely political base. Otherwise, it's Humean rationality, that instrumental rationality in which it is subject to emotions. It can be, is a slave of the passions and so on and so on. It will do whatever you choose. And you get this understanding in Western thinkers and ethicists also. That there is that ultimate choice of goods is a matter of free choice. If you want to value, religion, or somebody else wants to value humanism, these are personal choices. There's no rationality that directs one against the other. Your ultimate goals are simply matters of choice. Reason is only how to best achieve your own life, or how to convert other people, or how to deal with everyday situations. That is human rationality. That's common to everybody. That's instrumental. But your ultimate choices are based on something much more visceral, much deeper, maybe genetic, maybe upbringing, maybe a combination of things, maybe prejudices. Why do people have different opinions? Why do they act in different ways? Plato said they're all wrong. These are just opinions, doxa. In fact, I didn't put it here because I repeated it elsewhere, that the word doxa, which means opinion in Plato and is downgraded from knowledge, also means it seems good. It's often translated doxa, it seems good, or it seems to be, and was the standard formulation in the pronouncements of the Democratic Assembly, which were prefixed every sort of order passed by the assembly, who would read as it seems good to the people of Athens, and then whatever law, whatever this thing. So that was a formula, edoxem, it seems good. And this is what Plato says is these opinions are just opinions. So he's using contemporary juridical language and investing it with certain meanings, which are entirely constructed by the distinction between knowledge and opinion and which we get this now even in current epistemology between knowledge and belief, that justified true belief, what is knowledge? How do you move from justified true belief to knowledge? For Plato, there is no sort of, and a lot of modern commentators deny this because I think they are embarrassed or they don't want to see Plato. People don't talk necessarily about, some do, but a lot don't. People will talk about his metaphysics, they'll talk about his epistemology. They'll say, well, there's no politics in the Republic. It's only a moral work. He's the inventor of morality and so on and so forth. But there was morality before Plato. And that was also political. Sorry. What is that second question?
Can you bring the body back into it? Something about.
Oh, can you bring the body back?
Wait. Let me just read it out. Is there a way of reading the body back into Plato after the
separation of the? Yeah, well, in a sense, the body is also a metaphor for the body politic, as we call it. The analogy between body and state is so closely tied that the state can be seen and figured as a body, the limbs, as it were. I think, is it in the Arthashastra, you also get this idea that, so you have analogs, ways in which you understand the state as composed of. And this idea that you see that if it's a body, then there are, some people have to serve, some people have to fight, and some people have to run it. The guys with the brains, and in the Timaeus, the rationality is located in the brain, in the head, which again has a history of where is thought and reason and emotion to be located, where is it to be found, what are the organs that are concerned with it. So the body is very much part of any thinking, and of course the Greeks were great celebrators of the body.
Questions from the audience.
So, wonderful talk. So, I would like to know who were the audience of these dialogues? Did they belong to people who were going to be bureaucrats? And the other question is, can we say that imposing virtues and morality on commoners or subjects of of a nation is also a discipline mechanism? Because we can, if the subjects are virtuous, the ones who govern them, it's easier for them to govern them. They can be virtuous, not opposite of virtuous, but if the subjects are virtuous, it's more easier. So it's like a political strategy to easily govern the virtuous subjects. Can you say that?
That's right. That's very good. And sorry, the first question was
audience of
the audience. Yeah, that's a very interesting and important question. And of course, there are different kinds of answers. There was one famous philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, who wrote a book called Plato's Progress, I think, in which he argued that Platonic dialogues were actually meant to be performed, because they're dialogues and so on and so forth. And he had an interesting take on it, that, but I think what others have argued here is, obviously these are written dialogues. They're not, they're not like poetry meant to be memorized or enacted like tragedy or sung, which were the usual forms in which literary productions were presented. They may have been studied in classrooms and things, but of course in Plato's own academy, since he founded a school, they would have been the subject, presumably, of instruction. And maybe, just maybe, we have no, I don't think there's any evidence for or against. The dialogues may have been used as kind of points of departure, and may have also, some of them emerged from those discussions. So the other point that often is made is that these were texts written for like-minded, for educated upper class patricians who were living, after all, in a democracy. And there were lots of problems for rich people in the democracy. And there's a lot of criticism, they criticize, for instance, Pericles introduces a kind of subsidy for people to come and attend. But if you're poor, or if you're a working class, you can't afford to miss a day's work or 2 days work to go and attend assembly and to vote on some matter. So he introduced some pay. People who came would get some money. And the patricians criticized this, saying that, yeah, what kind of this thing is, you know, if you love your city, why wouldn't you give up a day's work? They didn't have to pay for it. So there's a lot of criticism of these popular measures. And you have extreme examples of this criticism in the place of Aristophanes. You have in one place, the women take over. Now, this is kind of comic high relief, you know. This is what democracy is, the women take over. And what do they vote? What do they want? And so on and so forth. So this is also a kind of subtle critique of democratic practices. And how do they take over? They steal the men's cloaks and the raat ko chale jaate hain, usko old ke, and they go and the men can't come out because it's so cold. And so they go and they suddenly vote and then they take over all the power and think that they behave typically like women. They said, this is a joke. It's a joke because this is what he thinks democracy is doing. There are all these women shouting and making racket. Anyone can speak in the assembly. What kind of place is this? This is exactly how we feel sometimes about our own politicians. You know, they're only in it for their own game. But the kind of abuse that was permitted, the kind of things that Aristophanes says about the rulers of the time, it's just amazing. You wouldn't be able to say, you call somebody a sausage seller and somebody who, and then, you know, they're going to stand for election and this guy says, why didn't you stand? And he says, I've never, you know, I'm completely uneducated. He said, perfect. You know, if you're uneducated, you're the right kind of person to be elected, and so on and so forth. Extreme criticism of democracy, but permitted in the democracy. So I think, you know, the intellectuals were, and personally, I think that this was the flourishing of the arts, all of which disappeared soon after. After Macedon took over, all this over. The Greek miracle lasted mostly the tragedies, the plays, the poetry, the philosophy. It's circumscribed by those two events, extreme democracy. I mean, there was much that was wrong with Athenian democracy, and it's very different from our democracy, so you can't just transplant the criticisms, but certainly they were open to criticism to some extent. Sorry, did I get your second question? Because the second one was about the audience, and the second was, yeah, about, of course, I mean, to give you a simple example, I didn't dwell with it. There is a virtue called temperance, which is sophros. It has various meanings over the years. But its central meaning as Plato is that to be temperate is to understand that your superiors are your superior and that they are doing things in your interest, and obedience to them is temperance. So obviously these virtues are highly political. So it's also to manufacture the consent of the ruled, which he says is the best way. And how do you manufacture consent of the ruled? You persuade them. How do you persuade them? You persuade them with lies. Only the rulers are allowed to lie. And he says very explicitly that, you know, a patient cannot lie to his doctor because he has to tell him the truth. So similarly, the ruled cannot lie to the rulers, but the rulers are allowed to lie, and he calls that lie the noble lie. And what is the noble lie? In brief, it has two components, both of which very interestingly are based on current, that is at that time current, myths. So there is a kind of tradition behind them, which makes it easier for people to assimilate that idea. What is the myth? One is, of course, the Athenians believed, like many people, that they were autochthonous, born from the earth. That is, they were native, just as we believe that we also are native, that we came from this very land. That is what gives us our rights here. And that is why in the US, if you're born in the US, you can become a citizen, because none of them are native, and they at least know that that this is not our land. But the Athenians thought that they were born from the land. That is one myth that he uses. That everyone must be told that all men are brothers. So that we all come from the same. So in that sense, we're all equal. But he then uses another myth, which he adopts from Hesiod, which is the myth of the metals. And he says that we are all born from the earth, but we are composed differently. And we have different, some are gold, some are silver, some are bronze, and some are iron. So we must know our place. So gold will rule, silver will fight and defend, and the bronze walas will obey them. And gold will look after everybody. So here are these myths, and he said very explicitly that we will feed the generations. He said, people actually believe this, one of his interlocutors. He said, not immediately, but after a few generations, we'll keep feeding them with this thing, and ultimately they will absorb it. So there is your caste system, which has been fed for generations, perhaps, which is now very much part of our makeup. Sorry.
Hello, sir. So, to know oneself or to have knowledge of oneself is caring for oneself. So, extending it a bit further. So, if we go back to the church and the practice of confession, having the confession box. So, over there, the person used to sit inside the confession box and used to confess, and the father used to sit just beside, used to hear. So, this practice of confession has often been interpreted as how the person is telling something about himself or herself and purging himself or herself of certain things that the person has done. And this is often, and how by confessing about oneself, the person also gains knowledge of oneself. So this is, and this, like scholars like Roy Porter or Brian Turner, they have often interpreted that how this practice has often been extended to the present medical system, where the practice of confession still exists, like between the patient and the doctor, or even between the patient and the caregiver. So in today's world, where often people go, like let's say interviewers or anthropologists who go to, let's say, interview HIV positive patients. So over there, like there is an extensive scholarship which exists telling that all these NGOs and interviewers, they go and when they question and when the patients, they tell about themselves, their lives or something, it's a form of care that the NGOs do to these patients. And also the interviewers, how they care for these patients, for these people, and all. But I think this care, I think it's not care, but the language, because the language of care is very nuanced in the sense that it's quite undemocratic because the knowledge already exists beforehand, and whoever is asking, the person already has the knowledge and he uses that to segregate the person he's interviewing. And that's it. So this is my how I perceive it. So my question is, do you think that there is any form of care that exists? And if so, how do you perceive this practice of caring and self-caring, if at all it exists in these systems?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because you had this problem with sociology also. There was that, what is it, ideology in the social sciences of whether anthropologists, when they go and collect data or meet, sort of people belonging to a certain ethnic or some group, that they would be carrying their own categories, their own understanding, and somehow this would interfere in their, if you like, data collection, because they would bring their own assumptions into this thing, whether they would, good for the person. So it wasn't as if there was a common platform that was shared between, say, some tribals living in some valley in some remote part and a anthropologist coming from Northern Europe, because his understanding. And so this is something that has to be overcome. So in that sense, maybe, just maybe, I'm just thinking about the Socratic claim of ignorance is not to bring any of his own preconceptions into the picture. And in fact, the method of questioning that Socrates does is in keeping with his own claim to ignorance. He doesn't offer any position. What he does is he takes the person's own answers and uses them to show that there is some deficiency in the kind of questions he asks. So a person whom he questions is made to, this is the nature of Socratic dialectic. It is using, it's a kind of negative dialectic. It reduces the opponent to self-contradiction. So Socrates doesn't bring supposedly any of his own ideas, assumptions. He's neutral. And I think this was the aim of also anthropologists to somehow look at the data as given to them to try to understand a society from within its own framework rather than bring another framework to it. Now, in the confession, presumably the framework is the same. The confessor and the person the priest he's confessing to have a shared understanding of what transaction is being done. They have a similar form of life. They have the same belief system and the same faith. So this kind of transaction is possible. And of course, in psychoanalysis, you have the same kind of, to come to open the truth, to know yourself by revealing yourself to the. And the Buddhists, I think, Buddhist meditation also, Buddhists also were supposed to confess their sins. That was part of Buddhist practice. And I think the earliest texts also talk about that kind of confession. So yeah, there is, I'm sure that is both a problem as well as a challenge to get onto the same page if you're not on the same page. Is that it?
There are questions. We can take a couple of questions so long as our battery lasts. We have the room till 12:30.
Oh, I love that battery. Tremendous question.
We have 31%, so I think you're doing well.
Should I ask for the question? Helgoland.
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 Yeah, that's Carlo Rovelli. Yeah.
That's the novel about Heisenberg.
Okay, fine. I think.
Yeah. We'll see you for lunch, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was going, so I wanted to give
He'll
it
be back.
Okay.
Yes, it's last.
So are there more questions, please?
Yeah, question, sure.
So this is regarding to the question, the nature of knowledge. For example, if you see the metaphysics of that age, the Platonic metaphysics, and the metaphysics of present age, there is a big difference in the way the idea of this, the primordial content of knowledge that was given in Platonic dialogues, unless that is given by today in forms of modern technique, if I have to say that. Because let's say from modern technique, we have modern science, culture and art, everything that is given in the present age is very different from the idea of knowledge that the Platonic dialogues were trying to, give people. So how do you see this? I was reading this essay by Martin Heidegger. He was making this distinction between what is thinking and what is philosophy. So Heidegger says that philosophy is nothing but a study of metaphysics, and thinking, which Heidegger believed that it is very easier, but it is quite difficult to accomplish in our everyday language. So the idea of knowledge, let's say, what we are getting today, as like what can philosophy actually give? So for example, if you are returning to this primordial content that we are getting from Platonic dialogues or Socrates, and if you are seeing it in the present age, the present metaphysical age, which is full of modern technology. So don't you think the idea of knowledge itself is something, it's very different. So what would these Platonic dialogues what can they do at present? What kind of sensitivity that we can actually bring back from these dialogues? Like in a form of like how these dialogues can give people a kind of pedagogical education to learn about morality, virtue, or something like that. My second question is regarding this idea of poetry, because Plato was quite anti-poetry. So Gayatri makes this distinction between the idea of language. So let's say whatever we are getting as a form of content, we are getting it through a language. Because language is the way, is a mode through which we connect this world that is outside of us. So there are two ways of knowing. So you make this distinction between language. Language as common, so our everyday language that we use in our everyday life, chitter chatter, the ideal talks that we make. And second, he says that there is what he calls in German as different, that there is some kind of deeper connection with language, which poetry actually brings. So how do you see, like, there could be a poetic way of understanding the world? For example, a modern man would go to a forest and you would see a technical man, a technical being would go to a forest and you would see all the trees as something. We have to cut the trees and like make some new furniture out of that thing. But a poetical being, as Heidegger also points out, he would look at each tree, from each tree, in an Aristotelian way, there is a different kind of furniture, coming out. From each and every tree, there is a different kind of furniture. That poetry actually provides us. That poetry gives us the language through which we can understand this deeper connection with our world that we understand.
So can I just ask one supplementary question? Because in this last part, the poet, you said, will see the different kinds of furniture that can come from different trees, rather than see the environmentally beautiful trees, uncut. I thought the poet would be a little more this thing, and in that sense, he would be like Krishnamurti, just see the tree as a tree.
For example, we see the Rivayati Najar, the cutters in our villages, they would see that a different kind of furniture is coming out from each tree. And a technical being would go to a forest and you would say, look, we have to cut all the trees and bring, like, the purpose is to.
Yeah, one may be a contractor, the other an artist, so the artist would see, the poet would. Yeah, that's a nice. The more complex, the easier question to answer about Heidegger on metaphysics is more difficult. But the easier question to answer, which is not so easy either, is the relationship between Plato and the poets. And there's been a mountain of literature and work done of why, and people are embarrassed by it. A lot of poets have written about it, and they all find some excuses for Plato. Actually, it's the religion that he's attacking, and the poets were, so propounding this strange conglomerate of Homeric religion and gods doing terrible things, and, mythologies, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, one of the obvious things is that the poets were very important. And philosophy is a nascent discipline which is making its way and trying to, sort of capture. It's like, is it physics or arts that should be studied here? What shall we do? Is this science institute or arts institute? You guys are useless. So similarly, Plato is also saying, you poets, tumhari kya auqat hai? What have you been doing? You're just talking nonsense. So my point is that Plato is a great fashioner of arguments. But he has a target. Now you have the target, then you decide now what argument will best knock this target down. So you have democracy. What is democracy? It is the will of the people. It is the people giving their opinions. How do you get rid of them? You construct a metaphysics in which you show that this will of the people, this opinion is just low grade. इसमें तो कोई दमी नहीं है. असली बात क्या है? Knowledge. Whose knowledge? Philosopher's knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Reason. What does reason give us? Truth. So where are you? Achha, the poets. Where are the poets? ये तो बीच में, they're also just pandering to the populace. They're making cheap images. Plato completely ignores And this is what embarrasses many of his critics who are also many of his followers or many classicists. He completely ignores the great contribution, tradition, the absolute magnificence of Greek tragic theatre. For him, it's nothing. What does he do? He invents a thing called mimesis, imitation. What does he say in that? He said we should remove everything which is in direct speech. What happens to drama? Everything is in direct speech. All actors are acting. मतलब सारी tragedy को उसने एक one line में हटा दिया.
His own dialogues will go out.
But his own dialogues are narrated. They are embedded within narrations. In some cases, the direct speech will go, yes. So he uses images. He condemns people who use images, but he uses his own images. He condemns people who use myths. He creates his own myths. So he is a rascal in many ways, you know. But obviously a very influential person. The great divine Plato. You know, the whole world is still. So, I mean, there is a real interesting issue here of the exile of the poets. At one point, he says, okay, they can stay there, book 2 and 3, Republic, they're allowed. As long as they, you know, follow this thing, because you need some early education, you need to give bachas some stories and things, and lies are all right for bachas. Certain kinds of lies, as long as they promote the book. So, very much didactic. Later, he says, sabko bahar nikal. All of them, Homer, we thank him very much. You're a nice guy and thing, but we have no room for you and ask it. Why? Because he's got his own literature going now. What will they read? They will read dialogues like this. This is what they will study. So, if you like, people say, look, this is a completely theoretical idea. Plato is only exploring some possibilities. This is not, you can read it as a fascist state. You can read it as a communist state. You can also read it as you know, because after all, look at all the strictures he places on the ruling class. No private property, no marriage, no children, no money. So this is completely idealistic. Can you imagine having politicians who had no children in this country and no money and no private property? Who would enter politics? Nobody.
They'll be forced to.
They'd be forced.
4 or 5 years after studying maths for 15 years.
Yeah, well, so anyway, so these are extreme proposals, but they're highly influential ideas that are still circulating. People still talking about them. Still, so far as the metaphysics is concerned, of course, Plato's metaphysics are being criticized from you know, day one. Aristotle criticizes them, and I think. I mean, one of the obvious things is that Plato has discovered, this is early in the history of philosophy, he's discovered what a concept is. The forms are just concepts. Now, you can say that they are somewhere. Where are concepts? Is he a realist? Is he a, you know, is he a essentialist? Of course, he's the essentialist that you have a kind of proto-nominalism in the amongst the sophists and others. But so he has discovered the concept. Now, concepts aren't anywhere. You can't divide concepts physically. I mean, and those paradoxes he looks at in, you know, dialogues like the Parmenides, where this criticism of the forms is not. He's the only philosopher, maybe not the old Russell is another one who does the same thing, who criticizes himself. So Russell was well known for holding some view. And then when he changed the view, anybody who was still holding Russell's old view, he would criticize them. Ki tum sab galat ho, you know, you're saying this, but this is what you used to say. Well, I'm not saying this anymore. So, but Plato actually criticizes himself. And there is a very interesting sort of development. And people are still trying to reconcile early Plato with middle Plato, late Plato with early Plato. And there's a whole industry. And you can spend your lifetime rereading. I actually find rereading the dialogues, even the early ones, things that I thought I knew really well, or then I read it and I say, oh, this is something different here. So they're kind of open-ended exercise books. That's what I feel. They lead you into areas which are surprising each time. That's why you can, you know, Platonic texts can be read and reread, discussed and rediscussed. in many ways other texts, you can't discuss and rediscuss Hume or Locke or someone over and over again. Heidegger is another one you can keep discussing. But I don't know whether it's easy to get to the end of the Heideggerian outlook of what is thinking. He, of course, thinks that Plato and Aristotle all got it wrong. It's a complete decline from the early Greeks.
Believe that there was some kind of primordial content in the Greek philosophy that is being lost in today's modern language. And that primordial content, what I believe, it's a kind of sensitivity. So Heidegger believed that there was some kind of primordial content, like in the way, for example, if you read, I was reading Phaedrus. So if you look at the Socrates dialogue, there was this kind of sensitivity that was kind of concealed with the coming of metaphysics, ontology, and for modern technology, it is completely like concealed. Like you can't see that. There is no transparency in achieving that sensitivity. And if you go back to this Greek philosophy, to this earlier pre-Socrates philosopher, we see that from this sensitivity, the primordial content in their language, in their dialectic, is something the epochal understanding of being was actually opened up in the Greek. So it was the Greek, there was this sensitivity, and he wants to bring that sensitivity back in language, which is, I think, impossible for present day modern science, modern technology, because they have concealed the distinction. For example, let's say if we see biophysics today, so we see that the biophysics has what the biophysics does today. It has made the distinction between man. For example, with biophysics, I'll be able to say this person is skilled and the other person is a dumb, illiterate. The very idea, and this is being done by modern science, modern technology. And Heidegger is like he's warning us against this danger. Look at this is the danger that is coming to us. So we need to go back to the tradition and like bring a new understanding of our ways of understanding the world. That is how I would understand.
Well, certainly Heidegger takes us back to early Greek thought in a way in which, has been absent. And also, sort of relooks at, rereads, reinterprets the meanings of words, and is doing his own kind of philology. What is interesting is the complete gap, if you like, between, say, the Anglo-American way of doing the Greek thought and the Heideggerian way. And often there seems to be no or little meeting point between them.
Shall we take one last question? Did you have one?
And the one who
She's been like very, she's like, I'm just.
And she's had the mic all
Yeah,
the
she's had
time.
the mic, she's been very selfless.
Please, you can ask 2 questions.
It's like, okay, I'll ask after lecture, perhaps when we work for
Yeah,
lunch.
you shouldn't hand over the mic to your friends twice. That's your.
Acha, aapko-
Selflessly. Hello, sir. So, care of the self becomes a very important point of thinking for Foucault. So, he has a book, History of Sexuality, Volume 3, in which he, what to say? So basically, he says that modern subjectivity is problematic because of the fact that. So basically traces the tradition from the philosophy of Plato, where he says that that the subjects do not really have their own will, but the thing is that they are that they're subject to different kind of laws by sciences and the government. So that's where so basically subject becomes an emptied out concept from the philosophy of Plato, and then Foucault says the fact that in the in the modern times, because of the fact that so in the modern science, in the modern world, modern subjects are basically do not really have a
not really have access to truth. So basically, they are they are situated, they are subjected to different laws by the government and the sciences, the state itself. The subject is basically it's an entry-out concept in the modern times, and that's what Foucault talks about. And so and that's what he talks about, and that's what he refers to this essay. Socrates' concept of the care of self, where he says that this is the point through which the modern subject can know itself, can have a creative access to truth through this care of the self, the concept of Socrates. So it's a very important, vantage point for Foucault. Thinking about the care of the self for Socrates. The one that was written by Socrates and not Plato.
Yeah.
No question.
Though Foucault is someone who is also pretty he's contradicting this concept of the care of the self. He thinks of it as a moral imperative. And then he's also saying that, okay, this is also a way, creatively, it's also a way through which the subject can creatively access truth by itself and not by, the different political bodies and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that, I can see the question behind this that you want to. Well, you see, Foucault has this idea, and he runs through those early lectures which come before, alongside that history of sexuality, and particularly that care of the sex when he looks at medical models as well. His idea is that in ancient times, or in Greek philosophy, and Socrates particularly first, it's difficult to disentangle Socrates and Plato. So when I say Socrates, we mean the Socrates that Plato is writing about. So let's not get into it. So the Socratic care of the self requires a certain effort on the part of the individual of realizing his nature. So you cannot care for yourself without doing something, and these something may consist of a whole series. This is Foucault's idea, whole series of real practices, say, controlling your diet, controlling your sexuality, various kinds of controls that you might implement in order to make that a necessary condition for knowledge. That is, knowledge is not something that is given on a platter in the way that Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Everyone can do that. Everyone knows themselves merely by the act of thinking. That in the ancient world, this knowledge was a privileged access for those who could make the effort to take care, to come to grips with, to know what their nature was. This was not Aam Janta ka kaam. What Foucault here at least ignores for the moment is the politics of this, which is what I was trying to do. He elsewhere, when he's talking about parrhesia, about free speech, and he ties that up with Socrates, that Socrates is an exemplar of this Greek idea, which is again very much part of the democratic outlook of parrhesia. Now, parrhesia is not a word that occurs frequently in Plato. Naturally, we can understand that. In fact, he makes fun of it.
Fedra says the drunk people have parrhesia.
Yeah, he talks of loose tongues, of too much talking, of too much interference.
In fact, that creepy man who preys upon young men has parrhesia. He's like a drunk person.
So Plato, on the other hand, uses metaphors of loose tongues, too much speaking, as a way of characterizing democracy. So you get, and Foucault sees, I think Foucault there is seeing himself as Socrates also, of fearless speech, of being able to speak. Now, the fearless speech is possible only because the democracy allowed it. Ultimately, it was the democracy that also executed Socrates, because they saw him as a representative of the aristocrats. And shortly before, there was the seizure of power for a very brief period, the so-called 30 tyrants, some of whom were pupils of Socrates, Charmides and others. Dialogues have been written by Plato with that name. In fact, the dialogue on Charmides is about temperance and how Charmides as a young boy was known for his soberness and temperance. These are the words for Sophrosyne, but became a really bloodthirsty tyrant. He was one of the worst of the 30s and was put to death. So, there are all kinds of plays here, how Plato thought about his uncle, and Charmides was his uncle. And he was a pupil of Alcibiades, was again closely associated with Socrates. Plato writes 2 dialogues, or at least one, from which I've been quoting the Alcibiades, first Alcibiades. In the Symposium, he's a major character. He was a huge figure in ancient, but he eventually went off and joined the Spartans and fought against the Greeks. And against the Athenians, the Athenian Greeks. Anyway, so there is a lot of, sort of contemporary politics that is mixed up in the Platonic dialogues as well. I don't know what I was answering though. What was the question?
But Foucault's morality.
Yeah, the Foucault. So for Foucault, the ability to know requires great effort on the part of the subject. So the subjectivity is important, the constitution of the self. And that is a necessary, and you get parallels in other systems. For instance, in the Vedanta also, in Shankara, you get the idea of what is it, in the commentary to the Brahma Sutras, there is, before the first sutra, which goes Athato Brahma Jigyasa, thus arises the desire to know Brahman. So the commentators say, well, since the word thus has occurred, there must be something that is necessary. What is necessary before the desire? Then they give a whole list of all the features that a person, you must have, discrimination between the permanent and the impermanent, you must have this. So the self has to be already, if you like, equipped for knowledge. Whereas in the case of technical knowledge, it can be taught. Somebody can transmit it almost by touch, not quite, but you learn this thing, somebody will teach you, your computer kaise fix karte hain, motorcycle kaise banate hain. Technical knowledge is non-problematic in this way. But this kind of self-knowledge is contrasted with technical knowledge, and then probably Heidegger also has something to say about that. So Foucault is very interesting, and I think I would recommend, if you look at his lectures now, which have all been translated in the Collège de France, the whole series, what is it called? The sovereignty of the necessity for the individual. I talked about that also. He also quotes from Alcibiades, the necessity for the individual who would govern to first be able to govern himself. That there is this plainness, you see this in Plato. Not everybody can govern, only those who can govern themselves. Government of self and others, I think that's the volume. And this is a demand that we often make of rulers. I think in the Indian tradition also, this is the demand that rulers must be also, self-realized. They must not be, this is a normative ideal. Rulers are not like that. Plato's rulers were not, the Democrats were not in it for helping other people. That was not their aim.
Very nice. There is one more urgent question. Okay, we have run out of time, and the battery is at 10%. Very quick question, very quick answer.
Hi. Since you made a comment on the conversation between anthropology and the kind of work it's doing, you made a passing comment, I think, on the kind of, it's not provoking, but
okay,
need your serious thoughts on it. So you made a comment saying that anthropology, the assumptions that anthropologists have, gets reflected in the kind of work they do, especially in the settings of hospitals, the work on illness narratives and so on, right? So I thought the other way around, because the concept certainly has some sort of life in the field, right? To put it more readily, you see a certain concept. It's not like we have certain concepts in our mind and then do the fieldwork, and how the fieldwork leads to these concepts. I thought it's the other way around, because if if I look at anthropological literature recently on illness narratives and hospital settings, what we see is that you do your field work and the kind of ethnography you do, and this field work gives you a nuanced understanding of the concept that you have already known. So, what are your thoughts on it? Because
I think it's an old and standard problem between the subject and the object. I mean, look at it philosophically. To what extent does the subject constitute the object that it grasps or understands? Whether you look at it through categories of the understanding that Kant had, or the attempt, for instance, of phenomenologists to somehow subvert the presence of the subject in their methodology by bracketing and all kinds of philosophical techniques. The aim is, how do you get, and you get theoretical versions, like sense data theorists and things. How do you get immediacy in which the mind does not interfere? How do you blank in? You get it in the same problem in meditation practices. If yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, how do you stop the mind from making its own assumptions, projecting, and so on and so forth? Can you even get the thing in itself as it is? Can it be given to you? So this is my broad understanding of this, whether it's a historian or this thing. Your aim is obviously to get at truth, but is this truth ever available? And you get amongst the atomists, and this is something that was not in this paper, but you get this attempt even amongst the Greeks, that what is the relationship between perception and the world? So the Platonists will deny that the perception gives you the world at all. It was only thinking. And this is why the predominance of direct apprehension. It's given in the language of perception, but it's cutting out the senses. The senses belong to the body. The body is defective. The senses are defective. They give you an unstable, wavering world. You discover the concept which is transparent, translucent, and stable. It doesn't change. Its meaning is fixed. And it can only be invited directly. So you cut out all the middle people, which are the sensations. And this privileged knowledge is, again, an attempt to get from subject to object with nothing in between. Others have denied it's just not possible. Some have said there is no object. Others say that there is an object, but the senses will interfere. And say the atomists who took up this problem, they said truth is in a well. That there are atoms in the void, but you can't see atoms. And you can't see the void. All you see are products. In the Vedant, not that we want to assimilate everything, you have, avaran and vikshepa. There is projection and concealment at the same time. So reality is not something that you can get hold of. Now you apply that across this thing, you can get very pessimistic about it, that in fact there can be no real conversation between two people. Because your approach, your ideas, ultimately are different. So what to say of my being able to understand, somebody whose language I don't understand, whose framework? Look at the kind of anthropological constructs that were made in notions of taboo, manna. I'm talking about the old stuff that I read. I don't have any contemporary knowledge of what the anthropologists today are doing. But that old ideology in the social sciences and so on and so forth confronted this problem. How do people get out of their own shoes and try to get into somebody else's shoes? It's very hard. I'm not saying it's impossible. That's the aim that you may go with some concepts, but the data may be able to shape your concepts, but the data itself is already being processed. As before its data, there's no raw fields, there are no raw data. There is some, I think in the Indian thought you have that Nirvikalp, Savikalp, Pratyaksh. There has to be some Nirvikalp Pratyaksh in order for there to be Savikalp Pratyaksh. But you can't get the Nirvikalp Pratyaksh. You can't see things as they really are. Just as well.
Yeah, let's turn on the mic. With the dilemma that I had a couple of questions, but I'll bother you.
You're paid now. All questions are paid questions.
Yeah, we'll just sort of. We are going to bother you after this as well because you're going to join us for lunch.
Oh, great.
So we'll not let you eat.
Can we return this?
It'll be taken care of. Don't worry about it. So thank you so much, Vijay, for this wonderful talk and for answering our questions extensively. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. And we will, as I said, off camera now bother you. So thank you very much for coming again and giving a very different talk with some similar themes. Eventually it ended up being, like that time you were talking about poetry and the early poets, and this time about Plato. So yeah, I mean, despite us being different people, we can't converse, I think we managed somehow. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Vijay, whom we can't see because the camera is pointing in another direction, but for coming and giving us a wonderful talk yesterday. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to the participants on Zoom. Bye. So first I stop this.